Good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome everyone to Oakdale High School here in Frederick County this afternoon. I'd like to thank Principal Bill Kofeld and his great administrative staff for opening their doors today for this important conversation. We are proud to be the fastest growing district in the state of Maryland, with young families consistently choosing FCPS for their children. We have 5 simple goals in FCPS. One is to maintain an organizational culture of achievement, to promote operational excellence, to ensure the safety and well-being of our students and our staff, to encourage stakeholder engagement through timely, transparent, and concrete engagement, and to cultivate wellness and civility for our students and our staff. Today is a wonderful opportunity to gain pivotal feedback as we prepare to welcome students back in August. I look forward to this conversation, and I'm just so proud to have our own staff, Amanda Portner, an educator from Thurmont Middle School and a former FCPS Teacher of the Year, here to provide her perspective, along with Thiago Hardy, Sean Steinmetz, and Iana Verk, who are giving up their time this summer to share what they need from us as students. We thank you all for being here today, and we welcome you. And now I would like to introduce the National Assessment Governing Board member, Marty West.
Thank you, Superintendent Dyson, for that welcome. I want to express great thanks to Oakdale High School and Frederick County Public Schools for allowing us to use this beautiful school as the backdrop for today's release of NAEP Long-Term Trend results. We're always grateful to have the opportunity to focus our attention and that of the nation on the core of education, which of course is teachers and students together in schools. Whether you're joining us here at Oakdale High or tuning in virtually, thank you for being here. My name is Marty West, and I have the privilege of serving on the National Assessment Governing Board, which sets policy for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, better known as NAEP, or the nation's report card. For more than 5 decades, NAEP has helped the country understand student learning. And while every administration of a NAEP exam is important, the NAEP results released over this past school year may be the most important in its history. The results we'll learn about today come from the 2023 NAEP Long-Term Trend assessments of 13-year-olds in the subjects of reading and math. And they mark the final set of results of a series of NAEP assessments administered as schools were emerging from COVID-related disruptions. Each of these tests had also been given just prior to the pandemic, in 2019 or 2020, enabling us to provide as clear a picture as possible of how the pandemic affected student learning nationwide. The picture that has emerged so far has been sobering, showing unprecedented declines in students' knowledge and skills in every subject tested, math, reading, civics, and history, in every age group or grade level, and in virtually every state and school system across the country. Today's results will provide additional cause for concern, even for alarm. That's why we want to use today's discussion as an opportunity not just to look back at the pandemic, but also to look ahead. We're grateful to have with us an amazing group of students and educators to share about their experiences learning and teaching during and in the wake of the pandemic, and more importantly, what supports they need from all of us, parents, advocates, school board members, and policymakers to make up lost ground. We'll turn to that conversation right after we dig into the latest results. But to get things started, I want to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Peggy Carr, to present the results from the 2023 Long-Term Trend Assessment. Dr. Carr, as you all know, is the Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, and will share the findings and take your questions. So Dr. Carr, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. West, and good morning to everyone here today. I think it's appropriate that we're here in a high school. It's a place that represents the next step in the academic travel and trajectory of what students we are going to be talking about today. The release of the long-term trend assessment results, 13-year-olds, is the last you've heard in a series of releases of the 2022 National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's going to give us a snapshot of how the COVID-19 has affected the achievement of American students. Before I dive into the results, though, I want to provide some important context around the unique circumstances of 13-year-olds and what they have experienced over the last few years. When the pandemic was declared in March 2020, and we all remember that well, it was followed by massive school closures. These 13-year-olds, well, they were 10 and 11 at the time, and they were completing 4th and 5th grade. A very important time in the young student's education career, we would all agree. To understand the nature of the school disruption, well, NCES was able to use the NAEP infrastructure to quickly launch the monthly school survey. This intervention allowed for us to quickly gather critical information real about what was happening in school communities across the country. Other special data collections, such as the School Pulse Panel survey, was also afoot. It helped us to capture take a real strong look at other information and issues that are facing schools and students during this pandemic period. And it covered a lot of ground, including staffing challenges, mental health, learning recovery, of course. We learned a lot about students' learning and overall context of schooling throughout this period. As soon as it was safe to administer the NAEP assessment in person, NCES, well, we were out in the field in force. We were in schools learning what students knew. We were working with our schools, the school personnel, and how students were really navigating through this terrain. In the early months of 2022, for NAEP, we visited thousands of schools and gave assessments to hundreds of thousands of students, a large proportion of them middle schoolers. At that time, NCES administered NAEP in reading and math, U.S. history and civics, as you've heard, in 4th and 8th grades. The results, which you will see, have captured in these headlines you see here today, tell us a lot about what was happening with students' achievement across the various subjects. Today's long-term trend assessment for 13-year-olds help us round out that picture we have been capturing for the middle school students throughout this time. This is the latest look. Now, we're going to turn our attention to the most recent NAEP results. I'm going to begin with a brief overview and then go into more details about mathematics and reading findings for 13-year-olds. At the beginning of the 2022 school year, NAEP collected data from a national sample of 13-year-olds, most of which, well, they were in the 8th grade, but we also included some 7th graders, because 7th graders can be 13-year-olds too. We assessed a little over 17,000 students in both reading and math from 460 schools. It is important that I note that 82% of the schools were also sampled in the previous data collection in 2019, because this really strengthened our design. The first data collection in the long-term trend assessment goes back to the early 1970s and is still administered in paper and pencil today. To ensure we all understand when this particular data collection occurred, what years we are going to be comparing in my presentation today, I want to walk you through this slide. The data collection window for 13-year-olds participating in long-term trend was between October and December as the time period we always select for that age group. Today, the results I will discuss will compare data collected at the beginning of the 2022-23 school year that has just ended or is about to end for students, to data collected in the beginning of the 2019-20 school year. This was before the COVID pandemic was declared and all of the schools closed around the world, not just here in the United States. In a sense, these data allow for a pre-post-COVID comparison and help us to understand how academic achievement has changed over the last 3 years for this cohort of students. Here is an overview of what we've seen for the past 3 years. Mathematics on the right, reading on the left. The asterisks here indicate that the 2023 score is measurably lower than the previous year's score of 2020. The amount of that score decline is next to the downward arrow that you see pointing downward here. In mathematics, well, we're seeing a 9-point decline over the past 3 years. In reading, we're seeing a 4-point decline over the same time period. When looking at the results for percentiles, we see in both mathematics and reading drops across all of the selected percentiles I'm showing you here. In mathematics, however, the lower performers decline at a higher rate than the higher performing students, their higher performing counterparts. And reading, the decline between the lower and higher performing students, they all went down, is not statistically different. So now let's go into these results a bit more, and we're going to learn about the math assessment and what students were actually asked to do. Compared to main NAEP, where the purpose is measuring students' knowledge on current curricula and standards, long-term trend seeks to maintain a relatively stable assessment to compare across years for 13-year-olds as much as 50 years ago. Long-term trend assessment assesses basic skills and recall of definitions. Over 70% of the items on the mathematics assessment are multiple choice, and the remainder contains 1 or 2 digit responses. That would be fill in the blank. The items range across content, as you can see here on the slide, but mainly focus on numbers and numeration. Here you see the complete mathematics trend line. As a reminder, we saw a 9-point drop from 2020 to 2023, as indicated by the large arrow to the right of the screen. This is the largest decline we've ever seen in long-term trend mathematics. To help contextualize these results, I will compare the findings from this time period to the previous time period. That would be 2012 to 2020, where we also saw declines. Not as large, but still a measurable decline of 5 points. So what that means is that we have 2 consecutive declines in mathematics. This is important as it suggests students were struggling in mathematics before COVID began. To better understand the average score, it's important to look at performance across the entire distribution. Here we see a selected set of percentiles, 90th and 75th. Well, that represents higher performing students at the top, shown here. And for the 10th and 25th percentiles, also shown here, those are for lower performing students, and that is at the bottom of the slide. As a reminder, an asterisk indicate that the number is statistically different from the 2023 number. What you see here is that everyone has declined. Both higher and lower performers, they have all declined. However, lower performers have declined at a higher rate as seen at the bottom of this slide. Like I said a moment ago, These drops were occurring previous to the school closures that we all know so well. From 2012 to 2020, we saw the average score decline, and that was driven by declines at the bottom. So when you look at comparisons to the first assessment year you see here, you see that those sharp declines at the 10th percentile have resulted in the 2023 score being no different from the first year when we collected these data. This is not the case for the other percentiles as indicated by the asterisks on those scores in the first assessment year, but it was for the 10th. This slide shows school students' group performance in mathematics. When comparing 2023 score to 2020, we see drops across race, ethnicity, except for Asians, both genders, economically disadvantaged students, students in all regions, school locations, and across English learners and disability status. When you compare that to the performance from 2012 to 2020, you see that many more groups saw declines in the most recent period. But you do see that Blacks and Hispanic students, male and female students, students economically disadvantaged, students in the Northeast and in the South, in the city, suburban schools, across English learners, disability status, have all shown declines twice in a row. As I close out the math section, I want to share a finding on course taking that we found in this latest long-term trend data collection. We asked 13-year-olds about math classes that they were taking, and we found in 2023, 24% of 13-year-olds reported taking algebra. This is lower than the 2012, where one-third of the students reported taking algebra. The data suggests that this is a pattern, though, that is largely driven by students in the west of the country. So that summarizes the math results. Now we're going to transition to reading. Essentially the same content as the 2020 assessment. The reading assessment is almost all multiple choice and focuses mainly on locating and recalling information from very short, specific passages, making inferences, and identifying the main idea of the passage. As shown at the beginning, we saw a 4-point decline in reading compared to the previous year, shown here. This decline is the second in a row as indicated by the downward arrow over the 260 when compared to the 2020 score, when compares the 2020 score to the 2012. When you look over the long term, you see these last two data collections are the only two where we saw declines in reading since the very beginning, as indicated by the upward arrows that you see here across the entire trend line. Another point is that the 2023 score is not statistically different from the very first assessment year, as there is no asterisk in the 1971 number, and that's an important point to keep in mind. In reading, we're seeing drops across all of the selected percentiles shown here. As you see here, both higher and lower performers are declining, as indicated by these asterisks. As I bring in the 2012 to the 2020 comparison, you see students at the 10th percentile show a large decline, and we're the only percentile declines at these ones that we show here, comparing 12 to 20. These back-to-back declines for the 10th percentile have lowered the scores for our lower performers to the point where the 2023 score for these students is lower than the score of 13-year-olds at the 10th percentile in the first assessment year of this study, of this data collection. In contrast, the highest performing students, those at the 75th and the 90th percentile, have 2023 scores higher than the first assessment year. And for the 25th and the 50th percentile, well, they're not statistically different from the first assessment year. Here is a look at the student group findings. They're interesting. When comparing scores to the previous assessment, we see that Black, Hispanic, and students of 2 or more races have declined. In addition, both male and female students, status as economically disadvantaged, students in the Northeast and Midwest, all school locations except town have declined. Both ELs and students with disabilities showed no change from the previous assessment year. Student group changes in the previous assessment year show only one change, a decline for students in the Northeast, as shown here. Well, this suggests that the pandemic may have accelerated learning declines for many student groups, with declines being more widespread than they were before. As we close out the reading section, we want to share a question that we asked students about how often they read for fun on their own time. As you can see here, in 2023, 31% of 13-year-olds reported never or hardly ever reading for fun, a higher percentage than the last 2 previous assessment data collections. As you might hypothesize, those who read less frequently tend to score less on the assessment. So reading for fun is important. These data show how the answers to the question differ across higher performers and lower performers. And you can see them, the lower performers are on the left and the higher performers are on the right. At the bottom of the slide, you see that 42% of lower performers said they never or hardly ever read for fun versus 17% of higher performers. On the other end, at the top of the slide, you see that 28% of lower performers stated that they read for fun on their own time at least once a week, while more than half of higher performers stated the exact same thing. So before I take questions, I'll do that in a minute here. I want to quickly summarize some important takeaways for these results. These findings show consecutive declines for long-term trend math and reading. However, it is fair to say that the pandemic may have accelerated some of these declines in that these are the largest math declines we've ever seen in this data collection. And the reading decline has brought us back to the first assessment year. While the previous declines were driven by lower performers, these new data show everyone is declining, lower, middle, and higher performing students. In fact, the lower performing students with our math assessment are dropping at a faster rate than their higher performing counterparts. And reading, the drop, well, it has been uniform across the distribution, but the 10th percentile students are now performing lower than their counterparts in 1971. In closing, I want to reiterate that this is the last in the series of what we're referring to as pre- and post-pandemic assessments and contextual data collected through the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the nation's report card. NCS will continue to work with our partners to inform the path forward and to help the field respond to the need for learning recovery. Clearly, we need it. Later this year, the school pulse panel that I mentioned earlier will launch the new school year coming up, surveying schools once a month about recovery strategies. In September, we are hosting a math conference, or math summit is a better name for it. And this will be a focus on an eye of what it is that is happening with these math scores, because they're very worrisome, these declines. And in 2024, we will collect more data from 4th and 8th graders in reading and math with our main NAEP assessment, providing a look at how not just the nation, but for states and districts as well, and how they have been faring over the 4-year period with these wide spread closures that we have experienced and all of the disruptions. We will also include questions next time around about recovery. But first and always, I want to thank the students and the schools and the school personnel who participated in this assessment. And of course, I want to thank Oakdale High School, and this is my home state, for welcoming us to this wonderful location here. You've been a wonderful host. So now I'm going to open it up for a few questions, and we will see what we have here in the audience first. All questions are welcome, or just comments.
I have a question from online.
Okay.
So these results are for 13-year-olds who are both 7th graders and 8th graders, and were there differences by grade?
Yes. If I didn't mention it before, these were mostly 8th graders, about 61%. The rest were 7th graders. And for mathematics, where we saw the strongest widespread decline, both 7th and 8th graders declined. But for reading, the decline was really for 8th graders only. The 7th graders did not decline. So yes, we saw some differential findings by grade level. Good question. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Well, we have more online.
We do, and more are coming in. What types of skills are kids having the hardest time with? Can you tell?
Well, these are all basic skills. You know, if I didn't reiterate that earlier, and reading, we're really talking about search and recall, mostly search and recall, mostly multiple choice, and fill in the blank for the math assessment. So students are really dealing with basic skills for both of these assessments, and the application of them in a very, very general way. The problem solving is not too difficult. Multiplication, for example, or the application of formula for finding the area of a triangle. So it's really not that difficult. That is what students are being asked to do here.
I have more from Zoom. There's a whole bunch of people out there on Zoom. All right, so what implications do you believe these results have for social and emotional learning?
Well, you know, these students really have been through a lot, not just these 13-year-olds, but all of students across the United States and across the world. And what we're, not necessarily in these data that we're looking at today, but what we're picking up from other data we're collecting at NCS is that students are really struggling with mental health issues. And it's interesting, it's not just the students, it's also the teachers. And schools are doing the best they can to work with students who are struggling in this area, but they're not always feeling that they're actually being as effective as they want to be. There's also issues of bullying that we're seeing. Cyberbullying, you might guess, is also up. Chronic absenteeism is also up for students. So there are a lot of issues that need to be considered around these results that we are seeing today. It's the whole child that needs to be focused on. These results, we're focused on only the academics, but it's the whole child that really needs to be part of our focus moving forward. Do we have time for one more question?
Oh, back there.
And we have a question here. Great.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was any study done on the reason why this is happening.
Well, you know, when the chaos was really at its height, there were a lot of hypotheses about what was going on. We were teachers and schools, I mean, they turned on a dime to try to get things back in order, but it was really chaos. Students were sometimes in school, sometimes remote learning, sometimes a little bit of hybrid. So people hypothesized that that might be part of what was going on. And the research shows that, yeah, it was an important factor, but it was not the only factor. It was probably not even the main factor. There were some schools, for example, in our data that we released in October, that were out most of the time, and they scored, you know, pretty well. But the opposite was true for other areas, and they were in most of the time. So, you know, it's complicated. And I think many of these factors that we just discussed, mental health, disruptions, staffing, I didn't mention staffing, teachers are struggling, schools are struggling to have the right staffing available. So there's so many factors. It's complex, but we're continuing to collect data to better understand how to bifurcate what are the main factors that we need to focus on. The important thing here, I believe, today is recovery, to keep ourselves focused on moving forward with these students, giving them as much time on task as possible, and helping them to regain those skills. And these are basic skills, as I have described quite repeatedly here. These are basic skills that the students really are struggling with. This is what we need to do moving forward. Okay, well, thank you.
Wait, can I ask just, oh, I'm sorry.
One more time?
Sorry, one more question, because I thought.
One
this-
more, Dr.
sorry.
West.
This is a question that keeps coming up, so that's why I'm asking. Several people have asked. When you ask students about reading for fun, do they consider the kinds of reading they might have done online? For example, my son might say he doesn't read for fun, but he actually reads quite a bit of information online.
This is a question we get all the time, and these data probably aren't well suited to answer them because we didn't ask that particular question for this data collection, but we will be asking that question in 2024 when we collect those data. And that gives me an opportunity to reiterate that we need to stick with the recovery efforts that I just described. And in 2024, when we look at these data, along with some of these types of questions that were asked here about contextual factors, to see where we are in 2 data points past the data collection that we're talking about today, from 19 to 20. That is when we're going to see have a stronger indication of the pattern of these results for recovery.